Cool. Basically, in general, energy access refers to physical infrastructure for both lighting and cooking needs. But access doesn't always mean that energy is reliable or basically affordable, good quality, or even safe to use. So we know that SDG 7 focuses on affordable and clean energy, mainly for lighting and cooking. But from a global perspective, about a third of the population around the globe, it basically lacks access to clean energy. And in sub-Saharan Africa, that number is about 57%, and then in Gambia, that number is up to 55%. And a big part of this is the actual energy transition, so the shift to cleaner fuels, which has to do mostly with affordability and then also household energy choices. So we know that households will make choices based on how important certain issues are to them. So for example, if a household doesn't have food to eat, they don't really care where their energy is coming from. So this work is basically centered in the Gambia, which is a really small country in Western Africa. Might be hard to see, but the outline is kind of in purple here. And over half the population in this country is considered rural, and they've had a really slow transition from dirty fuels to cleaner fuels. So since 2021, we've been partnered with a Mandela Washington Fellow who's helped us get a lot of this data, and we've sort of continued this research way beyond the fellowship that was just in the summer of 2021. And so the data that I'll be kind of talking about today is from the 2010 and 2015 rounds of the Integrated Household Survey that Amadou, who is our partner there, so generously helped us get from the government. And I guess lastly, given the limited assessment in the country, this analysis is one of, I think, the first to kind of provide insights on electricity access and fuel transitions in the country. So to further contextualize this topic, we can look at different shares of fuels in urban and rural areas to kind of get an idea of what fuels are dominating and then if those have changed over time. So I've divided households into 10 different income classes, with 10 being highest. And what I'm showing here is basically grid electricity in orange, fuel in gray, which is generator, kerosene, candles, and then decentralized energy sources, which is battery powered lights, mostly battery powered lights, and then a little bit of solar there too. So for lighting first, in kind of the urban context, you can see that electricity in terms of fuel share is increasing with income class. So 2010 and 2015, and so basically the orange bar is increasing with income class. And we can also see that electricity, at least for urban, is also replacing the decentralized energy and fuel, at least in the mid and high income classes. But then when we get to rural, the base electricity in the orange down here is way, way smaller even to start off with. And then we can see that the decentralized energy sources, so kind of those battery powered appliances or lights, really make up a much larger share, especially as we move to 2015, which you can see mostly here, but then also for the other income classes. And so for cooking, it's kind of a similar logic, but the dominant fuel here is firewood. So what's kind of interesting is that in 2010, on the urban side, firewood decreases with increasing income class, which is expected because they spend more money on, let's say, charcoal or fuel. But the opposite is kind of happening. It's hard to see because it's small, but the opposite is happening in 2015, which is kind of indicating a backwards transition. Not good. But in rural, there's not a lot of a story here because basically 98% across all income classes are using firewood. But sort of in general, over time, we're seeing that grid really access has not really improved for rural, which I'll keep talking about, but has slightly for in the urban context. Yeah.
I can't see that well, but is charcoal in there, or what are the three?
Yep, charcoal is orange on this side. So you can't see it here because it's so small.
Yeah, it's a small one.
It's more pronounced in the urban.
And the gray is?
The gray is cooking gas.
The gray is gas for cooking.
And you don't have electric cooking anywhere there?
No.
Nobody responded.
It's just it's wrapped up in here. But
okay.
yeah. Okay, so what we've also done is show household energy transitions over time by income class. So here, the solid line is the 2010 data, and then the dashed is 2015. So at the top there, you can see the orange line is electricity. And basically electricity again is dominating, and basically we can see that the percentage of households with access has increased slightly over time. And again, for rural, that decentralized energy in the yellow dash line is so high, likely because of different access programs that are implemented in African countries, whether that's from like USAID or the UN or even government programs. And so then for cooking, again, similar story. There's like that slight, the blue dash line up there is the firewood. So there's like a slight increase even with income class in that later year. And then again with the rural cooking, not much of a change over time. So in a general sense, as income increases, we're seeing that access is increasing, but rural transitions continue to remain a challenge, at least in the country. Okay, so the goal of our modeling analysis here is to determine the key driving factors of fuel choices and electricity access. And so we've modeled urban and rural households separately because they behave differently. But given the constraints to access are far more pronounced in rural, that's what I'll be showing today. So I have two types of regression models that are going to describe basically conditional probability. So a multinomial logit model using different fuel, so basically the fuel sources to show the probability of use relative to electricity, and then a generalized linear model using a binary response variable of 1 if they do have access and 0 if they don't. But what I'm showing here are basically both models, and I've removed, I guess for simplicity, I've removed the actual magnitudes of the coefficient variables, and I'm instead distinguishing the variables that are significant and either basically highlighted in red if there's negative coefficient and green if there's a positive coefficient. So the variables at the top there, like education, income class, etc., are what we're studying, and then the fuels on the left, again, relative to electricity, if you know how these models work. But what I really want to highlight here is that the probability of electricity as a primary lighting fuel basically increases with income class, which we kind of saw before, and then also as expenditure on energy increases as well. And then kind of similar for the binary logit model for the access variable, we're seeing that access increases as income increases. But something else I wanted to call out is that households, they can't always choose to have electricity as their primary lighting fuel if the infrastructure isn't there in the first place. And what you see in kind of in general, but also in research is like this, is that investment mostly goes to urban areas first, right? So that's a main reason why access remains so limited in many rural areas, not just in the Gambia, but also around the world.
And Brianna, when you say electricity, you mean grid electricity by the national grid or what?
Yes, grid electricity. Okay, so I've done similar modeling with the cooking fuels. So same variables at the top there, but then we have different primary cooking fuels on the left. And this time it's relative to firewood, not electricity. But the main takeaways here are that the likelihood of choosing cleaner cooking fuels, in this case, gas, which I'll explain, but basically increases again with increased expenditure on energy, and then also with household ownership, so moving from renting to owning. And then what's interesting here is the gender variable too. So female-headed households are more likely to opt for cleaner fuels, which makes sense because they're the ones actually doing the cooking in the household, at least usually, which is consistent with other research that we've seen in other countries. And so some of that research too has kind of backed that up with men making more economic decisions based on fuels, not as much of like the health impacts from burning charcoal or firewood. Yes.
I have a question. You said that as people spend more money on these fuels, certain things happen. Expenditures on fuel.
Yes.
A lot of the early stuff that we're trying to push all the different lighting, clean cooking and clean lighting. The argument was that these people are spending way more money because they have like lower quality, less efficient fuel, like they're trying to use kerosene, which is really expensive. Is there just some like conflict where if they're still using this, if they start spending more and more money on a crappy fuel, but then they're going to spend more money than somebody transitions to like a grid where they're using lighting, or is it just, is there any way to figure that out, or how that sits?
So lighting, cooking, different issues, different dynamics. In lighting, you're kind of constrained, like she said, since you are not deciding on investing in the grid infrastructure, right? So you are forced by constraints or infrastructure availability to choose alternative fuels or whatever else to meet your lighting requirements. In cooking, the story is slightly different. Some of these the alternatives generally exist in the market, but what matters is the way you actually access these fuels. So firewood in many of these rural areas, including in Africa and many other countries, are freely available for people to collect. They don't really pay any money as real cash outflow, if you leave out the economic argument of imputed costs and whatever else. So in that scenario, even when there is alternative fuels, more efficient, people won't spend the money to buy that because it just means higher outflow, right? But when what we have seen is, if you actually go down a level below to look at it, let's say at a village level or a community level, if there are communities where this is not freely available and they're actually having to pay money, then there is a expenditure threshold beyond which they would actually find a case to spend money on more efficient fuels because they just become more economically viable.
Right. In an urban scenario, there is almost no access to firewood anyway, right?
So actually, Gambia is one of the most interesting African, or rather most of the global, and among the most global South countries, to have a very high share of firewood and charcoal in urban households. If you actually tend to see, if you leave out a lot of other, if you look at most other countries in the global South in the energy access cooking narrative, urban households have tended to have a fair share of gas and some of the other things and less of firewood. So here, I mean, you're talking really low levels of policy and other things that haven't kicked in for the ecosystem to actually make even that available for urban households.
I would understand that the charcoal would be a big share in urban.
Which is true if you go back.
But it could be, but firewood, is that really true? People are bringing firewood.
Yeah, so if you go back, if you see that orange bar on the top is charcoal, right? So charcoal does make up.
Yeah, charcoal I would understand.
Sense, but because in Gambia there is very limited gas, cooking gas availability for two reasons. One, they import all their cooking gas cylinders and requirements, so they are heavily constrained to make a lot of that available at affordable costs. And that's why you don't see an uptake in some of that infrastructure. There are also some policy constraints I'll allude to right with the end, but yeah.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Cool. That's why I have that. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to note here is that household ownership. So again, renting versus owning can sometimes serve as a proxy for income and affordability, because the owner of the home is usually the one who's either applying for grid connection or making the transition to cleaner fuels. So for those that are renters, sometimes they get stuck in kind of in the in-between, because the owner will probably not apply for those upgrades because they're not the ones actually seeing the benefits. So just wanted to explain that variable a little bit more, but in general, we're seeing that gender and economic affluence are basically more likely to drive clean cooking fuel choices. So to kind of step back from all of this, all of this information and kind of what we've pulled out of it, we can then look at some of the policy implications for energy access, which Aditya will talk about next.
So if you just go back, so the previous slide. So that last point also ties into your question on, so the other constraint that we see is, for example, cooking gas is given by policy to as a connection or whatever the household has to apply to the government to get access, and there is a certain rationing of gas at a certain price that's made available. So you're saying if you are a renter and if the owner never really lives in that house, the owner does not end up applying for a connection and does not see the need to take the liability for the renter benefit, right? So if you have a high share of renters, in a certain area, you tend to also create the policy fallacy kind of creates its own constraint of access, of being able for people to actually move. So that's another nuance to how people can get moving on the transition story. Right. So as Brianna early on mentioned, Similar studies have been done on energy access for a lot of other countries, but relatively less in Africa. But that's also been due to the fact that we've never really had good household level data to analyze, to understand, how households kind of look at the choices on lighting and fuel, cooking fuel choices that they make. But thanks to USAID over the years, they've really done a good job of helping put a lot of household surveys on the ground, which is how we got the 2010 and the 2015 household data sets for the Gambia. And but the objective of a lot of these studies is to be able to help define and design efficient policy. The fundamental is that the policy needs to act like a backstop to energy transitions. And what I mean by that is, it's not just good enough if someone makes a choice to move to a better fuel at a point in time. It needs to be a sustained thing. You need to see time and again every year, right? At least they shouldn't fall back on any aspect of the transition that they, in terms of the more efficient, cleaner fuel choices that they make. So it's very important to be able to keep that as a benchmark when you learn from some of this data, and how that feeds into the policy process. Some of the issues that typically will come in when in being able to design and effectively create this policy ecosystem, first and foremost, are definitional challenges. So electricity access conventionally by most governments, including in Africa, is defined as having a connection, right? It doesn't necessarily mean whether you actually are getting electricity, A, and B, for the time and the duration and at the quality and reliability that you actually need it, and at the cost that you can actually afford to pay for, right? So the definition of what electricity access constitutes needs to change to have a slightly more stringent metric of the way you define it. That automatically then will force the policy and regulatory ecosystem to create that kind of infrastructure that's able to deliver, because your what you measure becomes that much more effective. In cooking, it's the same logic. But either way, one of the most fundamental things that we talk about is defining minimum energy requirements in terms of kilowatt hours for lighting, or in terms of in terms for electricity, or in terms of energy terms for cooking. And within that, then you want to be able to figure out how households. So one of the concepts that I would want to mention here is the concept of fuel stacking. So no household will use 100% of a clean fuel initially, especially when they're cash constrained. So you would always want to aim for them to start increasing the share of clean fuel within their lighting and cooking fuel choices over time. And so the definitional framework creates a very strong foundation for a lot of this, and any further steps that any policymaker or regulator needs to take. So that fuel stacking was my point on diversification of clean fuels in one perspective. The other perspective is what you initially talked about, electric cooking. It's always touted as a very nice thing from a theoretical perspective. If you actually look at it from any developing country context, including in Africa, when a government is cash constrained and looking at setting out electricity infrastructure and fuels infrastructure, you want to be able to ensure that the primary need for electricity is to meet lighting and basic electricity requirements for a household, not cooking. And therefore, the investments that you want to direct should be to first meet those needs and not talk about electricity for cooking. That's a very nuanced and very high-end perspective, which an ambition that probably in many of these countries you wouldn't get to. And that's why you look at diversification, because then you start investing on the cooking side to look at cooking gas and making other alternatives available that are equally efficient. But net effect that when you look at the allocations you make as governments, because typically money for electricity infrastructure is driven by a different ministry or department in the government. Money for fuels and cooking choices and that ecosystem is driven by a different department in government. And the two have their own budgets to deal with, right? So you are able to then get the best for the amount of allocation and public money expenditure that you create for each of these rollout plans. The third piece is, and we've talked enough about the fact that electricity access is not really a choice, but a constraint of just the fact that infrastructure is not available. But this is where decentralized energy can play a fairly interesting role. If you look at most of the examples, actually, not just in South Asian stuff, but even within Africa. So you look at Kenya, Tanzania, and some of the other countries, Ethiopia, where what they've been able to do over time is either create standards and benchmarks for what a decentralized home energy system needs to deliver in terms of system level performance or service level benchmarks, and that defines incentives, etc., that are given out, so that you're not just giving out a battery light, right? And that's not going to meet a minimum lighting or lumen requirement for an individual or for a household. The system needs to be able to deliver a little more than that. But if you go away from these home systems and talk about microgrids, which are a little more larger system sizes, about 5, 6, 10 kilowatt hours, and these can vary. We have varying definitions, but essentially, depending on the number of households you want to cater to, these microgrids can actually be designed to be the local infrastructure and joined to the main grid. So the grid does not have to extend entirely to a particular area or to the final village or whatever that it's catering to. It can stop there, and this can become an infrastructure in itself that connects. And so what that also does is it diversifies the pressure on public money to keep extending the grid. So they are able to create what in many ways we would call as primary and secondary grid rollout infrastructure. And the tertiary, which is the last mile, is actually taken care of by the microgrid, which actually sees a lot of private money coming in and creating its own ecosystem, and just makes the system a lot more efficient. And a lot of this has been done, so it's not that it's not proven. It exists at fairly large scales in many of the same areas or regions that we're talking about. The other thing is looking at the subsidy story. So many countries, because they don't have, take cooking for example, because they don't have cooking gas or whatever available, they tend to subsidize other inefficient fuels just for households to be able to access their basic minimum requirements. You take lighting, for example, not so much in Gambia, but in other countries, we've seen kerosene actually playing the default substitute for the lack of grid infrastructure. And governments actually provide significant subsidy on the purchase of kerosene or other inefficient fuels. So, once you're able to get to step 1, 2, 3, then the next logical progression is to be able to actually relook at the way the fuel subsidy ecosystem is structured, so that you're able to rationalize them and move that away from inefficient fuels to more cleaner fuels, but it requires certain other bases to be built up, as we just talked about. The last thing I'll say is, on the cooking side, there are some, so just the way we talked about decentralized energy for electricity and those innovations, in cooking, there are some interesting innovations. So typically what happens for cooking gas is that they're distributed as cylinders, and they range anywhere from 12 kg, 14 kg cylinders, but you can actually have smaller cylinders, and we talked about the fuel stacking. So you could have a 2 kg cylinder that can start, that'll be much more cheaper, more affordable, and can be something that starts substituting, let's say 15% or 20% of the household's cooking energy stack, and at least you're able to start having the household move a step forward, rather than if you were to do only a 12 kg or 14 kg cylinder at almost 4 times the price, then they would never even go out to even access it or procure it, right? So some of just those innovations and creating those distribution networks at the last mile for households to be able to go and access them. One of the other things you'll find often is even if this were to be made available, the smaller cylinder, the distance of where they need to go and access this cylinder, for example, is another constraint. Many of them are daily wage earners, and so for them to give up a few hours of a working day to actually go and get that cylinder, come back, is a loss of revenue, right? And they tend to see the trade-off. And we talked about firewood or whatever else being freely accessible, and very often in places of work that they are in, they just find it far more efficient to just do that and never actually make the case for a transition to cleaner fuel. And the last thing I'll say is, there is also things around community biogas, etc., which almost act like an infrastructure. So it's not an individual household biogas plant, but actually a community plant with pipe connections, etc. So you actually have a infrastructure that's created to cater to clean cooking, very similar to the way you look at the decentralized energy microgrid as a last mile to the electricity. So anyway, so the all of this study and the analysis that we've been doing for the Gambia, the aim is to be able to help define a lot of these elements of the policy framework as the country kind of figures out, its energy transitions and plan and design. So thank you. And any questions? Happy to answer.
Thank you. You keep mentioning the availability of firewood. Would you have any sort of idea of like what ratio is actually firewood bought at market? I'm assuming urban is primarily a market-driven, firewood economy, but what about rural? Do you have any sort of idea what that is? And then what genders are going out and getting firewood, whether it be market or actual, we'll say natural resources?
So for the first part, so we're also relatively constrained by the data set in terms of the questions in the data they collect. I think the 2010 data unfortunately never collected information on the quantities and some of the other parameters. But the 2015 data actually does have quantities and prices. So we could actually map, and that is something we're doing. We haven't cracked the full data set yet. But that's a part that we could answer potentially to look at, how much is being bought, how much is being collected, and that share, and kind of then that feeding into this element. Who goes to collect is a question you will never find in typical household energy surveys. And we actually, and that's a very pertinent question. When I did this similar study for India in 2010-11, we actually did about a 65,000 household survey over 4 years, where we actually had to force the government ecosystem to reframe the questionnaire almost multiple times to actually include questions like these, because that's not something they tend to think about. And the reason is the role of gender or household members in general playing, and the dynamics that play out to be able to collect fuels through the entire value chain is kind of almost taken for granted. They don't think that it's an issue that households need to deal with. And so, and this actually goes back a step, maybe something that isn't here is, how do you actually even train policymakers to be able to add certain nuanced questions within general national surveys that can actually help capture some of these elements and take a step forward. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, Kurt.
I was just gonna ask, going back to the data that you went through.
Yeah.
What, if anything, was like stuck out different about this particular country or these that you were working with compared to, because there's been lots of studies in lots all over Africa, India, Bangladesh. So was there anything different about this place, or do we just use the same approach that we did for all the other places that they've done similar work? So what, something stands out different about this? I don't know, it's culturally, or it's.
Yeah, so I mean, he has more experience in this, but based on like my research and my lit review, now these like fuel share charts, there's multiple things wrapped up in fuel, right? So I can also break out generator, kerosene, candles, etc. But for this purpose, it was in these categories. I think what's sort of interesting is the use of candles in Gambia. So I haven't seen that in any other like papers published for any other countries.
They
And
use it a lot for lighting.
yeah, and it's actually a pretty
Same
significant.
thing in Zambia, it's the same thing.
Okay, so it's a pretty significant share of those gray parts of lighting. I just don't have it specifically broken out. And I think so that we're not surprised that decentralized energy takes up there's a transition there moving towards 2015. And then I think for cooking too, we kind of saw a little bit of a backwards transition with firewood, especially as income class increases as you move towards 2015. And so I guess those are my initial takeaways.
And just to, when you talk about firewood there, that's firewood and charcoal together, or is it firewood?
No, so charcoal is orange here.
Yeah, but when you just said, you actually meant firewood. You didn't mean
What?
charcoal, you meant.
She means firewood, yeah.
What is
Because
it?
if you see in 2010, as incomes increased, firewood share actually was coming down. But when you look at 5 years later, the data is actually the other way around.
Yeah, because The reason I'm asking all these stupid firewood questions is when I did similar work in Zambia, I almost never saw people using firewood urban. They all use charcoal because there were charcoal vendors, it was coming in the city, they would go buy it. There wasn't any firewood anywhere. And it was so much volume to bring in firewood from the rural areas to be able to use it, that I didn't see anybody who used, except maybe a few twigs or something. So that's why I keep asking these firewood charcoal questions.
So let me put this slightly differently. I would look at all of these studies in some ways, you'll have to compare them at certain point in time to each other, in the sense that if you look at 2010 Gambia, 2010 India, 2010 Bangladesh, 2010 Ethiopia, every country is in a different phase of its own development, and it has to be contextualized in that story, right? I bet if you had done this study in India in 1994, the data would probably look fairly similar, right? It's just that imagine it like a phase of transition, and every country goes through that phase over time. It's just that everyone's at it at a very different point in time when you look at it. And also something that is hard to rationalize when you compare countries, the definitions of what is urban, what is rural, a lot of these things are different in every country. It's not the same. If you were to use that, at some levels, you tend to fall into the trap of, where people argue that, oh, you can't have a common definition, every country has its own nuance. The other flip is it makes it hard to compare. But these are some of the underlying things that I think we should just be cognizant of when we look at some of these numbers. But yeah, that's the way I would look at it. And even this charcoal argument, right? Or firewood. One of the things we actually reached out to the fellow from Gambia who was working with us was to actually try and help us get a little more understanding of what happened between 2010 and 2015 in terms of this charcoal market, right? There must have been some glitch somewhere, either in terms of availability or other end uses that resulted in households ideally not getting, or the prices went up to a point where firewood just became the more logical, cheaper choice. But but those are some questions that we're trying to actually, get to. Thanks.
Ideally, we'll get more data that's more recent, and then we'll see what happens. Kelly, did you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned these at the tertiary level, there are these microgrids. Those microgrids, what powers the electricity?
They're all solar microgrids. They're all solar microgrids. Yeah.
So how widespread is that?
They're pretty widespread actually. I you go to Tanzania, Ethiopia, even India, Bangladesh, there are a lot of private entities that actually invest in what is now called as rural microgrids. And there are actually the grid code in these countries was upgraded to allow for benchmarks and standard settings, etc., for microgrids to be the last mile infrastructure for the main grid. And once those grid codes are updated, it created a default market for things like these to exist because there was a regulation, there was a policy, it was more streamlined. But these system sizes typically, where at least the viability exists, ranges anywhere from about 10 to about 25, 30 kilowatt.
Kilowatt hours per kilowatts. What's your unit there?
Kilowatt hour of generated electricity per day. If that's the way you look at it.
10 kilowatt hours per day.
Correct.
Per resident or per
no,
household.
per day for the system. So if
per system.
So if you
system might have how many households?
Well, you wouldn't. So in India, for example, our lifeline electricity benchmark is considered as 1 kilowatt hour per day per household, which is supremely low. But even that, but most households don't even tend to consume that. So if you're doing half a kilowatt hour per household per day, you're talking connecting 20, 30 households to a system.
Mostly for lighting and television and radio.
Very basic, right? It's 2 or 3 bulbs, LED bulbs, and maybe a mobile charging, small little plug point. That's really what these systems are designed to cater to, and generally about 3 or 4 hours of power, of electricity in the house, not the entire day, right? But the reason they've been successful, let me put it like this, is they've been designed to be able to deliver electricity or whatever at a time when the households need it, rather than the grid, which is usually very unreliable, and what's the point of paying for something that you don't get when you actually use it?
Okay, yeah, so that makes sense. So what about the central grid? What's powering that? Are these coal-fired plants? or is it-
It's mostly coal, yeah.
Alright. So, you know, compared to, you're doing a coal-fired plant and you're generating electricity and then you go out and cook with it. It's much more energy efficient and carbon efficient just to cook with the fuel directly. Go to electricity and then you go back to heat, you lose a lot of energy and have a lot more carbon emissions. So it'd be better just to use the fuel.
Correct. So the LCOE argument for electric cooking versus piped gas cooking is exactly what you're saying. And that's why, in generally, the point I made on diversification of fuels is really that, right?
Yeah, and in Zambia, they were doing electric cooking in some of the urban areas, and then as soon as they privatized the grid and they started charging more for electric, it wasn't just a set rate, they actually charged per kilowatt hour. People stopped cooking with electricity and they were actually cooking with charcoal in the urban areas. They just
Makes
switched.
Makes
Because
sense.
a lot, what happens here is that people do the fuel stacking, partly because they're trying to go with price. And so when if it's subsidized or the price comes down something, just like we do here, you know, people are gonna go to one technology versus another. They'd like to be able to do that, I think.
What are the biogas sort of sources that you guys are seeing? And is it an increase sort of choice for rural communities for cooking? Or is it hit a peak and it's diminishing?
I don't think we've seen.
I mean, in like count firewood, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think we've
But-
seen biogas as a choice
Yeah.
specifically.
Sorry, I was
in
thinking biomass. Yeah.
Gambia, but in other places they've usually used agricultural residue and farm waste as the input for most of these.
Is it growing? Has it hit its peak and people backing off?
So I would say small biogas plants, individual household plants have almost died out, at least in South Asia for the most part. They're practically out of function. But community biogas plants have actually taken a resurgence, I would say, in the last few years. But with the notion that they're actually the large set up a little outside of the village, and then there's actually some last mile piped infrastructure that's getting the gas out to each of the households, so they don't have to actually deal with the plant itself. And
But the very limited literature on the Gambia doesn't mention biogas at all. I was thinking biomass, so I said firewood, but that's mainly what it talks about. Yeah.
I guess we're also constraints by, every country has its own, how much agriculture, how much waste, etc. is generated and what the end users are would kind of drive whether these things are viable, but definitely worth looking into for this as well to see if that works.
Okay, I'm gonna answer this one online. I'll just read it to everyone, but it says, this company BioLite makes a more efficient wood stove. Have you considered stoves like this as part of the transition process? Basically keep using wood/charcoal, but use it more efficiently.
Yeah, clean cook stoves are I'm biased. I think that they're not the good step, but it might make sense for countries like Gambia where you don't have any gas infrastructure at all whatsoever to even help push that transition. But these are very interim solutions in many ways. There is a lot of debate on whether they actually do deliver lesser health risks and mitigate indoor air pollution or whatever. But it's worth looking into. But from a policy perspective, I still think money is better spent on kind of some partial leapfrogging for cleaner fuels. That's my view on.
Is the charcoal production local or is it? I am wondering how the charcoal is being produced. Yeah, if you know.
I don't think we've checked that for Gambia, but typically it differs, I guess, region to region. Charcoal can be brought in so in a lot of places like charcoal can be brought in as end-use waste of other certain local activities that's then taken up by an informal market, created and then sent out. Can also be created by burning firewood and then still can use charcoal and process and get get back. So there'll be different ways in which, but yeah, I don't think there is any big formal ecosystem that makes charcoal per se. So it'll always be relatively informal and local. But he's done a lot more in Africa, so you'll have a better idea of this. I mean, at least from the South Asia perspective, that's the way it goes. But yeah.
I have a weird question, but you remember this guy CK Prahalad,
Yeah.
torture at the bottom of the pyramid, all that, everything, entrepreneurs were gonna solve all this for us? But I didn't see anything in your policy thing about, fueling entrepreneurship, fueling businesses, making incentives for private enterprise to do these things. And even though I think that some of that was a failure, I think there's a lot.
Oh, yeah.
So where does that come in here?
So this, right, we are
Yeah.
talking about the rural microgrids. In India at least, or Bangladesh, or even Tanzania and Ethiopia, it's been private companies setting up rural microgrids, actually not government. And they've been delivering, value to that. But I would say rural entrepreneurship gets pushed if you have a good policy and regulatory system that's designed to deliver. So for example, what was done well in some of these countries where you saw this happening organically was because they were able to set those grid codes, they were able to set the regulation here and do that, preempting that this could happen.
I'm not sure if I agree with that.
Fair enough.
I see the informal sector as being very powerful in a lot of these countries. And then if you kind of ignore the informal sector, which is usually going around most of the government policies. So, I mean, I'm throwing it out there. I'm not really disagreeing with you, but I'm throwing it out there like, how do you, there is some balance between the informal sector and the regulated sector.
There is. But what I'm saying is, so let me put it like this. The informal sector will anyway kick in when when policy is inefficient. The informal sector by default plays a much larger role in delivering whatever value they're delivering, right? The question is, can you bring a level of streamlining to the informal sector through some of this stuff? Yes. Will the informal sector then go away? No, it will still, but you give it a little more impetus because once you take some of those policy decisions, for sounding capitalists, for the flow of capital, whatever it is, from wherever it's coming from, just becomes that much more easier and viable if that helps.
I think we're in agreement, yeah. Thanks.
So we have a whole list of questions that would take another hour to go through based on what we've already done that include some of these that we would hope that our partner in the country can help us answer. Because those are important, and you can see from like those fuel share graphs and the line and dash graphs over time. We just visually we can look at that too, like what happened between those years and has the government stepped in, has it not, et cetera.
And then I guess Brianna, what about the data are you not that confident about? You're like you're the one who did all this crunching. What's some stuff that you really feel like we have to take with a grain of salt with some stuff that you just.
Well, the data, the raw data that we got, first of all, was a separate file for every single section of the survey, which is huge. And there was, I'm gonna be honest, there's a massive amount of data cleaning that has taken me months, or us months, and with the help of Hanif too, to do. So, we've kind of made steps along the way to select what the most important parts of this. So this survey isn't just about energy, it's the integrated household survey, which has everything about like health in every single member of the family, a lot of things about like living standards, I would say.
That occupation.
So we've gone through and like selected, the most important variables at first, and then we kind of keep narrowing that down to do things like this. And then you even have a smaller subset for actual regression modeling. So I would say, I don't know, I've done my best to clean it the best that I can. And we'll talk about that later, but yes.
Just a quick question. I'm not familiar with how these surveys work, but I can't help but think like, what's the compliance of the people in terms of taking these surveys? Like, how does the survey get enforced? And who responds? Do we know that?
Yeah. So at least in this case, so USAID, which is the US Overseas Development Assistance grant making body, which does a lot of this in developing countries, they were very instrumental in driving or rather financing the costs for these large household surveys in a lot of the African countries, including Gambia, over that period of 2010 to 15. And so they have a relatively very rigorous approach and process of training field workers, of finding the right people to deliver, do all of that. So they've gone through all of this to deliver this. Does not mean that surveys are perfect in that sense. You reduce the potential for bias as much as possible, but any survey, however well executed, will always have some bias, some reporting elements built into it. So you kind of go with that. But what I would say is, just from at least a number crunching perspective, to some extent you can assume that the bias is consistent across. So when you're looking at it, you're almost accounting for all of that within that and saying it to some extent. So, but this is good enough to give you, let me say, give you an 80% or even 85% story of what's really going on, and to kind of help inform policy, right? And hopefully anyone is a step better with this than they were with not even knowing what was going on. So yeah, but there are these processes that these agencies use typically to.
That was the other thing, is a lot of these are done by hand, at least we think, so.
Oh, yeah.
We had to there's problems in, basically the Excel files that I got with all of the data were, instead of, ideally you'd want number responses, which is how you analyze it, but they were words, so I had to convert them. I mean, at least most of them. And then there's parts where data is always missing in random places, or they answered one question, but not the first question that actually led to the second question. And so things like that, you have to kind of just take out, so that, other data problems that are inevitable. Cool. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah.